Okay, let's explore the concepts of communism, Marxism, and ultimately Maoism a little bit further. In Marx's ideology of 1848, of the Communist Manifesto, there's a sense of historical and international process at work in the world, a motor of history. This process required capitalism to reach the heights of its development, the heights of its excesses. And when industrialization and industrial capitalism, which Marx and Engels saw as taking place in Britain in the Industrial Revolution, reached the height of their exploitation, the industrial working classes, the people of the factory, would rise up. He felt this was inevitable. This industrial working class and Marxist ideology would be led by cadres, Communist Party members, not necessarily yet in the state of communism, Communist Party members leading that proletariat to overthrow violently the bourgeoisie, the investing capitalist classes, in a class war. This would lead to the temporary creation of a dictatorship of the proletariat. Proletariat again, the industrial working classes. They were urbanized. They were factory workers in the minds of Marx. Equality, the harmony of these societies would then be created during the dictatorship of the proletariat. People would realize the wisdom of sharing and getting rid of these divisions created by property, and people would work for the common good. In such a state, you don't need governments and police forces and jails. There's no one exploited anymore. There's no need to steal property because people will give freely of themselves. There is no reason to pay wages because everyone works for the common good. The state would wither away, with the words of Marx. The government would no longer be needed. The Russian-Soviet experience between 1917, their revolution, and the fall of the USSR, the Soviet Union, in 1991, was quite different. It didn't follow this process at all. The state established by Lenin was quite different to Marx's theory. I'm struggling to find the words here. Marx's theory. Tsarist Russia was an agricultural society. It had no industrial, urbanized working class to speak of. It really didn't have much of a middle class, bourgeoisie, capitalist investing class either. It had aristocrats. It was essentially like a feudal system. It was like a medieval society in 1917. Russian communists, the Russian Communist Party, were faced with the idea that historically, if Marx has got the great understanding of the world, Russia shouldn't have a revolution, that any revolution in Russia would actually be illegitimate by Marx's theory. When the 1917 Russian Revolution begins, it's actually brought about by liberals and others. This February Revolution was actually hijacked by the Bolsheviks, the communists, led by Lenin in October. They rename the Bolshevik Party the Communist Party. They're heading towards communism, not yet creating a communist state, even though it's called a communist country. It was heading in that direction. Lenin adapts the theories of Marxism after the fact to justify how a true dictatorship of the proletariat could sort of take place. Why is it that Russia could hit the accelerator and jump historical stages if Marx is so right? This dictatorship of the proletariat, led by the Bolsheviks, who call themselves the Communist Party in Russia, becomes permanent between 1917 and 91. First by Lenin and then by Stalin. Leninism, which is established between 1917 and 1920s, about 1928, and then Stalinism from 1930 to 53. These are ideologies which underpinned a totalitarian dictatorship, a one-party state that essentially was communist in name only. Other countries that were communist in the world, and a couple of them still are around the place, call themselves communist, such as in Eastern Europe, had very different experience as well. Communist parties in Europe before World War II that existed in places like Poland and East Germany and what was now is the Czech Republic and Slovakia and so on, had varying levels of popularity and often really relied upon the support of the Communist International Organization, Comintern, that was run by the Soviet Union, the Russians. They were popular really in the periods of high unemployment during the Great Depression. The preconditions in which communism could take place, according to Marx, in those countries vary greatly. In World War II, as you probably remember from grade 10, communists tended to be rounded up in Europe by the Nazis and their sympathisers. They ended up in concentration camps or became part of the underground resistance to Nazism. The partisans, that's where the name partisan, Communist Party, partisans, who fought back against the Nazis in a guerrilla warfare. The Nazis and other opponents of the Soviet Union, such as rival resistance groups, were actually defeated by advancing Soviet Stalinist armies in 1945. So anyone who sympathised with the Nazis, anyone who was a rival to communist partisans in Eastern Europe, were actually wiped out by Stalin's Red Army during the war. And a Stalinist style of communism was imposed upon areas that the USSR conquered. So Poland, after World War II, is described as a communist country. Well, it wasn't communist in the sense Marx meant it. It was Stalinist. It was maybe Leninist. It was something very different. It was a totalitarian state. It wasn't that Marxian communist idea of a utopia by any means. Sure, it had a communist party in charge, but it's communist in name only. Let's now talk about what you need to know. And again, I'll hit pause. I'm trying to keep myself pacing here for you. The Chinese experience of communism really in power starts in 1949. It, again, doesn't follow the Marxist historical international process, this process of historical materialism. In the 1920s, when Mao's joined the Communist Party, it only has a few thousand members. And it's supported by the Soviet Union. I can see a little typo there on the screen. The Soviet Union, the USSR, Communist Russia. It was supported and led by Comintern, the Communist International Organization, which was funded and run by Lenin and the Soviet Union. Because it was so small and weak, the Chinese Communist Party actually allied itself with the Kuomintang, the nationalists, or the old way of saying the word, in the way Gilly says, or way Giles' system is, Kuomintang. Kuomintang, Kuomintang, nationalist, all the same party. Now, get your head around this. The Communist Party of China, the CCP, had a few thousand members in the 20s at a time when China had a population of about 563 million people. It's tiny compared to the large population. It's not a mass party. It's a very small group of cadres. Now, this Chinese Communist Party is brutally purged by the nationalists. The Kuomintang turn on the Communist Party in 1927. And from that time on, there's tension between the two sides. The CCP fought a guerrilla war against both the nationalists and the Japanese between 1931 and 1945. Now, at this time, the CCP and the nationalists talk about having a second united front to throw the Japanese out. The reality is that while both nationalists and communists were throwing out the Japanese invaders, they weren't above attacking each other and taking advantage when they could. This is really a temporary truce to remove a common enemy. Now, the strongholds of the Chinese Communist Party start to develop in northern rural areas of China, where they got weapons and funding and training from, again, the Soviet Union, the Russians, over the border to the north. They built links with the peasants, not urban workers. They weren't an urban proletariat party. They were a party that connected to the peasants. When the Chinese Communist Party win the Civil War with Soviet support against the nationalist government in 1949, Mao's looking to a Stalinist USSR for inspiration. He's not really following Marx. He's actually looking at Joseph Stalin, the Communist Party dictator of the Soviet Union in order to see what model his country will follow. He follows that model until about 1957. After that, communism in China takes a distinctly Chinese feel, following Mao's views, Mao's ideas. And this is where we start to develop the idea of another brand of communism, following on from Stalinism, following on from Leninism, growing out of Marxism way back in 1848, that we can start calling Maoist or Maoism. So I want to leave you with one final thought. And again, it's from this expert on Chinese history, Frank Dicotta. And he says in his book, How to Be a Dictator, or actually he says, drawing upon talking about his book, How to Be a Dictator, that to a dictator in the 20th century, ideology isn't the most important thing. Power and the maintenance of power through loyalty to the dictator himself, the individual, seems to be the main objective of Mao, of Stalin, and to some extent before them, Lenin. So when we're talking about the Communist Party, we need to see the language, the ideas, the theories, and the reality as having a sense of dissonance between them.